Hey everyone, and welcome back to Let's Talk Politics. I know it feels like the world is on fire right now. Over the weekend, Trump announced 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports and 10% tariffs on energy. Canada is hitting back at Trump's new tariffs with 25% levies on US imports, with 30 billion Canadian dollars in countermeasures. Trudeau warned that these tariffs will have real consequences for Americans as tensions between the two longtime allies escalate. This news is quickly evolving and will break down the impact of these tariffs in our next episode. But today, we're rewinding to where this all started Trump's claim that the US is somehow subsidizing Canada. Let's get into it.
Oh, yeah, that's a hot one.
This was something you might have heard a lot, especially over the last few weeks, but we're going to be taking a closer look at this whole idea that Canada is getting a free ride because of like American generosity or something. So when we hear Donald Trump say the US subsidizes Canada, where do you even begin to unpack that statement?
Well, you got to start with the actual trade relationship between the two countries. It's huge. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars flowing back and forth every year. And the basis of Trump's claim is that the US has a trade deficit with Canada. So just in 2023, according to the US Census Bureau, Canada exported something like $427 billion worth of goods to the US.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is, but the US Census Bureau reported that the US only exported about $355 billion to Canada.
So there's a pretty big gap there.
Yeah, you're looking at about a 72 billion US dollar deficit or about $100 billion Canadian.
Wow.
Now, if you just look at those numbers, it's easy to see why someone might think the US is kind of getting ripped off.
Yeah, for sure. Just looking at how much money is going back and forth, but there's more to it than just looking at which country is sending more stuff across the border.
You got it. There's way more to this. And the first thing is that those numbers we talked about only look at physical goods. They completely ignore the huge amount of trade and services between the two countries. So think about things like financial services, tourism, airline services, telecommunications, even like the stuff you watch on Netflix. That's all services. And they're constantly being traded between the US and Canada.
So, are you saying the US might actually be making up for that gap we talked about in the services sector?
You got it. When you add in those services, the whole picture changes. The US actually has a surplus with Canada when it comes to services, something like 32 billion.
Oh, wow.
So that means the real trade imbalance is more like 40 billion, which is way less than that 100 billion figure Trump keeps referencing.
Okay. So, why does Trump keep calling our long-standing, totally normal trade relationship a subsidy? For anyone listening who might not be familiar, can you break this down and explain why a trade deficit isn't actually a subsidy?
A subsidy is when the government gives money or support to a business, industry, or group to help lower their costs or make things cheaper. Imagine you want to start a lemonade stand, but lemons are super expensive. If your parents give you money to help buy lemons so you can sell lemonade for a lower price, that's kind of like a subsidy. It helps you keep selling without losing too much money. Now, if someone tried to say that buying lemons from your friend's stand was the same as getting free money, that wouldn't make sense, right? That's kind of what's happening when people wrongly call a trade deficit a subsidy. International trade is the same. It's not like one country is just handing cash to the other. Trade is a two-way street. Americans buy Canadian stuff because they want it or need it, plain and simple. And let's not forget, the US dollar is stronger than the Canadian dollar, which already makes our goods cheaper for them. Plus, with nearly double our population, the US has a massive demand for products, so why not get them from your next-door neighbor? It just makes sense. Take Canadian lumber, for example. It's really good quality, and it's usually cheaper than American lumber.
Right? So that helps Americans build houses for less, which is good for their economy. So having a trade deficit doesn't automatically mean a country is losing out or getting taken advantage of. It's more like countries are focusing on what they're good at and trading to get what they need.
Exactly. And remember, the US has had trade deficits with a bunch of countries for decades, and it's still a massive economy.
That's true.
In fact, the trade deficit the US has with China is way bigger than the one with Canada. It's over 250 billion.
So having a trade deficit isn't automatically a bad thing for a country's economy.
Nope, not at all.
But Trump also seemed to say that the US could just produce all the things it gets from Canada right now, like lumber, cars, even dairy products. Right? Is that even possible?
Well, this is where the America First idea comes in. It's this idea that the US should always put its own interests first. And that usually means not liking trade deals and wanting to be less dependent on other countries for stuff. So the thinking is, if the US could just make everything itself, it wouldn't be losing money to other countries and it would save American jobs.
Hmm. But is it really that easy?
Well, from what we've talked about already, it seems like trade is a lot more complicated than just saying, let's make everything ourselves.
There are reasons why countries specialize in certain things and trade with each other.
You're exactly right. Yeah. And there's one really important thing that makes this argument really tricky when it comes to Canada. Oil. The US produces a lot of oil, but it's not enough to meet its domestic demand. It still needs to import a lot more to meet energy needs. And guess where a lot of that comes from?
Canada?
Exactly. About 60% of all the oil the US imports comes from Canada.
Wow.
And here's the thing. A lot of oil refineries in the US are built to process a heavier type of oil, a thick crude oil. Canada has a lot of it, and if the US wanted to switch those refineries to process the lighter oil the US makes, it would be a huge expensive project, and not something that can happen overnight.
So even if the US wanted to stop relying on other countries for oil, it wouldn't be easy or cheap.
Exactly.
So Trump's argument that cutting trade with Canada would create more jobs in the US doesn't really hold up when you think about oil. In fact, it might even cause job losses on both sides of the border.
It's a great example of how connected everything is, and how what seems like a simple solution can have consequences you don't expect.
This is already pretty complicated. So we've talked how reliant both countries are on our trade relationship. But what I really want to know is what if the US did want to stop relying on Canada for stuff? Could they just like flip a switch and start making everything themselves?
That's a really interesting question. And you might expect the answer isn't that simple. Remember, there are good reasons why these trade relationships exist in the first place. It usually comes down to things like cost, resources, expertise, and even just like geography.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like take lumber, for example. Canada has these huge forests, and they've been producing lumber sustainably for a long time, right? To make that much lumber in the US would take a ton of investment. Not just money, but also it would impact the environment. So even if the US could make more lumber, it might not be worth it economically or for the environment.
Would it even be good for consumers?
Exactly. People might have to pay way more for things that used to be cheaper because of trade. Think about how much it would cost to build a house if the price of lumber went way up. And it's not just about the immediate cost either. It could mean cutting down more trees in the US, which would be bad for the environment in the long run.
Wow. So there are all these effects that go way beyond just money. It's a chain reaction.
Exactly. It's a web of interconnected stuff. And sometimes changing one thing can mess up the whole system. And the same goes for other industries, like the car industry in the US and Canada is really intertwined. Parts in cars are always moving back and forth across the border. Trying to separate that and move a lot of car manufacturing back to the US could lead to people losing jobs, not just in factories, but also in all the businesses that support them, like trucking, shipping.
So it's not just about creating jobs in one place, it could hurt other parts of the economy.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the people who buy stuff. If the US suddenly cut off Canadian goods, there might not be enough of some products, and the ones that are left would get a lot more expensive. Imagine going to the store and seeing your favorite Canadian maple syrup cost twice as much.
Or having to wait forever to get a new car because the parts are stuck somewhere.
You got it. It's easy to forget about these things until they're gone,
It really shows how much we depend on trade. We just assume everything will be there.
right?
But there's this whole system of relationships and agreements that make it happen.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that there are always winners and losers in any economy. But when you start changing those trade relationships, it can cause a bunch of problems you didn't expect.
So, what's the takeaway here for our listeners? For anyone that still thinks the US is subsidizing Canada, which it clearly isn't.
I think the most important thing is to remember that these things are never black and white. Trade deficits aren't always bad. They're just one part of a much bigger picture. And just focusing on getting rid of those deficits without thinking about the bigger picture could actually make things worse.
It's like trying to fix something with a hammer when you really need a scalpel. You might end up breaking it even more.
That's a great way to put it. It's about realizing how complicated things are and being open to having more nuanced conversations, to look beyond the simple slogans and really dig into the data and how everything is connected.
It's about being a critical thinker and not just believing everything you hear.
Exactly. And that's super important these days because information and misinformation spread so fast.
You're right. This whole conversation is making me think about all the stuff we use every day that comes from this complicated web of international trade.
We don't even think about it most of the time. But there's a whole world of logistics and economics behind every single thing we buy, every service we use.
It's true. And sometimes even those everyday things can tell us a lot about global power resource distribution and how connected our world really is.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, and with each layer we find something new and interesting.
I like that. And just like peeling an onion, sometimes this process can make you cry as you face reality. But ultimately, it's about understanding how these systems work so we can make better decisions, have better conversations, and maybe even fight for a fairer world.
So are we saying that all trade deficits are good? Or that countries should never try to protect their own industries?
No, not at all. There are good arguments for fair trade, making sure workers are treated well, and supporting industries that are really important to a country. But it's about finding a balance, understanding what you might lose, and considering the consequences. So it's not as easy as just saying trade deficits are bad or protectionism is always good.
You got it. It's about understanding how complicated it all is and being willing to learn to see different sides of the story and to have honest discussions.
All right, I think we've covered a lot today. We've busted the subsidy myth, talked about how complicated trade deficits are, and what could happen if we mess with existing trade relationships.
We have.
But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with something to think about. We've talked a lot about the US and Canada, but there's another big player in this North American trade system that we haven't mentioned yet.
Yeah, Mexico. They're a huge part of the US economy, right? How do they fit into all of this?
That's a great question, and it kind of takes us back to that America first thing we were talking about, because one of Trump's big targets with all that was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Remember that I know it was a big deal back in the 90s, and then it got kind of controversial, especially when Trump was running for president.
Right? Exactly. NAFTA was this big agreement that got rid of most of the tariffs and trade barriers between the US, Canada, and Mexico. It was around for over 25 years and had a huge impact on all three economies, like it shaped industries and supply chains all over the place.
So, how did it affect the trade between the US and its neighbors? Was it good for the US, or did it make those trade deficits even worse?
Well, that's where things get even trickier. NAFTA definitely made trade explode between the three countries, but it also contributed to those growing trade deficits for the US with both Canada and Mexico. It's hard to say exactly how much of an impact it had because there was so much else going on in the world at the same time. Changes in manufacturing, technology, all sorts of things. It's something people still argue about. Some people say NAFTA was great. It boosted economies and created jobs all over. But others say it caused job losses, especially in manufacturing in the US. And they blame NAFTA for those industries going downhill.
It seems like we keep coming back to this idea that there are no easy answers when it comes to trade. What might seem like a simple fix can actually cause a bunch of other problems and affect different people in different ways.
You're absolutely right. It's all about understanding those different perspectives, weighing the good and the bad, and realizing that any big change, especially with international trade, is going to have winners and losers. There's no magic solution that's going to make everyone happy.
So, the whole debate about free trade versus protectionism and whether these agreements are good or bad is still going on today.
Absolutely. It's a conversation that's not going away, And it's really important to be informed about it, especially as we try to figure out this increasingly interconnected global economy. It's not just about the economic arguments, it's also about the social and political impacts of these trade relationships.
It sounds like understanding the trade relationship between the US and Canada is just one small part of a much bigger story, one that involves the entire North American economy and how it fits into the world market.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's all connected, and by looking at even just one piece of it, like this idea of the US subsidizing Canada, we've uncovered all these layers of history, economics, politics, and even environmental concerns.
It reminds us that staying informed is a journey. There's always more to learn, more connections to make, and more perspectives to consider.
You got it. The more we understand about these complex systems, the better we can participate in conversations. Make decisions both as individuals and as a society.
A huge thanks to all of you for hanging out with us today. We hope you learned something new and had a little fun along the way. Make sure to tune in next week for another deep dive into the wild world of politics with a brand new guest. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and let's talk politics again soon.